Hello, and welcome to this ARA webinar with staff from CPDA, the Council of Producers and Distributors of Agrotechnology, titled Adjuvant Advantage for the Sales Agronomist. This webinar will focus on adjuvants and insecticides and how these should be used together. We would like to take this time to thank Growmark for sponsoring today's webinar. My name is Hunter Carpenter, Senior Director of Government Affairs for ARA, and I'll introduce our webinar speakers in just a bit. But first, I'll go over a few housekeeping items so you know what to expect. Webinars are an important part of the ARA professional development pathway and provide a great opportunity for ARA member companies to help educate their employees. Today's webinar will be recorded and added to the member-only ARA dashboard section of our website. As a reminder, you can log into the dashboard to access past webinar recordings at any time. If you do not have an ARA login, you can email info@aradc.org to set one up. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation, but you can type them into the chat panel at any time. With that out of the way, I'm excited to introduce our speakers today, Johnny Roberts, Bill Chisholm, and Greg Dahl. Johnny has 45 years of experience in the development and technical support of pesticide, fertilizer, and adjuvant formulation. 44 of those years were spent with Helena Agri Enterprises. Johnny is also the co-inventor of 15 U.S. patents related to pesticide, adjuvant, or nutritional formulations. Bill has over 45 years of experience in agriculture and pest management. He grew up on a vegetable farm in the Salinas Valley of California and worked for the California Extension, a pesticide registrant, and retired after 22 years with the EPA, Office of Pesticide Programs. He received his PhD in weed science from Virginia Tech. Greg retired from Winfield United in December of 2023, following over 40 years working for both the private and public sectors. He's currently serving as president of the Weed Science Society of America and was president of the North Central Weed Science Society in 2017. He's been a certified crop advisor since 1998, and over 70 products have been brought to market from research by Greg and his team. Much of his research involves adjuvants and application technology. We would also like to acknowledge CPDA's advisory working group for all of their input in helping make this such a successful series of webinars for both ARA and CPDA. Following today's presentation, a QR code will be displayed for you to scan from your mobile device and earn 1 IPM continuing education credit as approved for by the Certified Crop Advisors. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Johnny.
Thank you, Hunter. A little bit about today's agenda. Our subject's going to be dealing with using adjuvants to enhance insecticides. Specifically, we're going to talk about the variables that impact the efficacy of insecticides. What adjuvants can we use to address those variables? Talk a bit about the label guidance for adjuvants used with insecticides. And because it is so unique, we're going to review aerial applications of insecticides plus adjuvants, have a discussion on water quality as they relate to insecticides, and a general discussion on spray mix compatibility. And Bill will also be giving us an update on ESA compliance. In terms of resources, the slides have links to these three. I'll be leveraging from these resources for today's presentation, particularly the Purdue Extension PPP 86 and the Purdue Extension that deals with adjuvants and the power of the spray droplet. These are excellent resources, and I'll be leveraging from them today. Next slide. So a little bit about insecticide spray applications and their characteristics. Typically, the active ingredients have both contact or systemic modes of action. The spray application volumes tend to be higher than what they are for herbicides and fungicides, but that's key to understanding how we use or why we use adjuvants with them. There tends to be oftentimes multiple component spray mixes. Maintaining crop safety is a priority, and you'll find that the active ingredients in many cases have stability concerns. So these environmental conditions and spray carriers impact both application and efficacy. Next slide. Environmental factors that impact our insecticide applications, they're oftentimes degraded by UV light. They can be degraded by heat. They can be washed off by rainfall. Next slide, please. And the carrier that we use for these applications, water, has aspects that make it very, very difficult to get a good application with. They tend to have water as a carrier tends to have poor coverage. It tends to bounce off the target, tends to evaporate, wash off, and then has a quality issue related to pH and other components that's in the water. Next slide, please. So, as we've learned in past webinars, we like to break adjuvants into two big groups. We have the enhancers, things like non-ionic surfactants, carbohyl concentrates, stickers, deposition aids. These things can have a direct impact on activity of the pesticide. Then we have the utilities, things that fix compatibility problems, that have controlled foam, reduce or mitigate drift, or condition water. Next slide, please. So our first consideration is always the pesticide label. It's labels that recommend or suggest the adjuvant use. Oftentimes, these functional ingredients and definitions may be lacking, and we'll be focused on that today. Some of this is improving as we get more CPDA certified adjuvants in the marketplace, and we have ASTM standardizing our definitions. Usually, the recommendations are very general. Very rarely are they recommended based on brand names, and they tend to be generic descriptors like non-ionic surfactants, crop oil concentrates, and methylated seed oils. Next slide, please. So what do the labels actually say? And I've got some examples of insecticide labels as they relate to adjuvants. You look at the first one here is imidacloprid, and they mention how a spray adjuvant is necessary to obtain thorough coverage, but unfortunately doesn't say what type of spray adjuvant. This is very, very common with insecticide labels when they do make recommendations. The next one is a methoxyfenicide, and they mention how that spray deposits and redistribution and weatherability can be mitigated or used with agricultural adjuvants as a way to control them. But again, no mention about what type of adjuvant or the rate. And then with a carbaryl insecticide like 7SL here, they are warning you about water quality and not to use in the product with water quality over pH of 8. But again, not a lot of directions on what kind of buffer or how to use it. Next slide, please. So this is important because unlike herbicides, you'll find very rarely insecticide labels that are specific about the adjuvant that's recommended or suggested. So there's oftentimes confusion. Not all adjuvants are surfactants, but oftentimes they treat them that way on the label. There's a general lack of knowledge and training about adjuvants with insecticides, unlike herbicides, which have an extensive, long history of commercial use of adjuvants, and the labels reflect that. You'll find that oftentimes missing with insecticides. Oftentimes, the labels that do recommend adjuvants lack the use rate or production guidelines. And then another thing that growers and applicators are not aware of is that even if the label does not recommend or prohibit an adjuvant, they're still free to use them. Okay, and then one thing that we always like to point out that in many, many cases, the adjuvants, or excuse me, the pesticide labels have implied adjuvant use recommendations. Next slide, please. This is language that was taken directly off of various pesticide labels, and you'll see that things will be on the label like thorough spray coverage is important. Coverage should be maximized. Verify compatibility. Rain may reduce retention on leaves, but these recommendations or warnings do not have specific guidance to using an adjuvant. And adjuvants have a fit with addressing all of these issues. And one thing we always like to point out is that we have no pesticide application that doesn't need just better deposition. Next slide, please. So how do we use adjuvants when the clear label recommendations are lacking? Well, the first is confirm that the adjuvant functional claims that you're using can follow ASTM definitions. The easiest way to do that is use a CPDA certified adjuvant because in very rare, in all occasions, the language has to be standardized by ASTM. The big thing that we're going to rely on going forward is just improving our product knowledge. And this is what we're going to be concentrating on today in making recommendations for adjuvants when uh, clear label recommendations are lacking. Next slide, please. So the second consideration in deciding on the adjuvant to use is what's the characteristic of the active ingredient? If it's a systemic insecticide, the insecticides with this mode of action are absorbed and transported through the plants, kill the pests when they feed on them. With contacts, the insecticide kills by contact rather than being absorbed, and it kills the insects when they directly come in contact with it. So this can have a big impact on the type of adjuvant that you recommend. When with systemics, you typically have greater chance of wash off. They do tend to have more water solubility. With the contacts, they tend to have a greater impact, a negative impact from evaporation, impacting them in a negative way, and they have a greater need for absorption enhancement. So you can begin to see the characteristics of the active ingredient can drive what we're trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish with adjuvants. Next slide, please. So these are examples that I've listed here of systemic versus contact. With systemic, we have things like imidacloprid, acephate, dimethylate, abamectin. These are all materials that depend on absorption to get into that plant. With contacts, we are dealing with just direct contact with the pest itself. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that oftentimes systemic insecticides are also active by contact. So these delineations are not absolute. Imidacloprid is a good example. It is both systemic and contact activity. So sometimes the adjuvant needs can blend together. Next slide, please. But both contact and systemic depend on good coverage. And that's why we tend to have higher spray application volumes. Most insecticides are contact in action, so most of the recommendations, suggestions involve around using non-ionic surfactants or oil-based adjuvants to enhance it. One thing to keep in mind is that with the spray volume issue, you're often given a range, a low to a high level. We can use the lower side of that spray application volume when we use adjuvants that enhance coverage. And this can be a crucial deal in economics because spray application volumes drive the economics of the application. If we are able to use the lowest level of that spray application volume, that reduces the amount of carrier and that we have to move and trips through the field. Next slide, please. Adjuvants that enhance absorption in almost all occasions depend on the fusion for that to occur. And this is simply a rule where things in high concentration move to areas of low. It takes moisture to facilitate this absorption. So adjuvants that reduce spray deposit evaporation tend to have the best impact there. Things like oils, glycols, and humectant increase the absorption, and they do it in a big way by keeping the material wet for a longer period of time. Next slide, please. One group of adjuvants that deserves specific consideration for this are the organosilicones. This group tends to have a higher degree of coverage and lower surface tension than other surfactants that are available. This can promote directly active ingredient infiltration into the plant by means of stomatal infiltration. There is over 5,000 published studies that document this. Anytime that we can increase the absorption, we get benefits like improved rain fastness, which can turn into improvements in efficacy and this general speed of activity. So stomatal infiltration is something that is variable. It can depend on the plant that you're targeting, but typically are those active ingredients that have some water solubility, like acephate, metacloprid, dimethylate, etc. Next slide, please. So improving retention or stinking, this is something that comes up quite often with contact insecticides, particularly those that are subject to wash off. And keep in mind that oftentimes a lot of these things have residual surfactants and dispersants that once the spray deposit dries and you have some rainfall, it can wash off the surface. Spray adjuvants that are based on latex, plant resins, pinene starches, and other plant soluble materials can improve retention and rain fastness. This is why you'll see references on some labels to use a spreader sticker. And then what we're looking for are those materials that can provide both sticking and spreading. And there are several commercial examples in the marketplace today. Next slide, please. Breakdown of sun due to sunlight is a real concern for insecticides. Realize that a lot of these active ingredients are meant to be unstable. They are meant to break down, do their job, and disappear. So anything that gets them out of the sun can be a positive. We don't have a lot of sunlight inhibiting or UV light inhibiting adjuvants or formulations. So it's oftentimes a issue of getting materials deeper into the plant canopy, getting them into the shade. We can do that. We can offset some of this issue that comes with UV light. Next slide, please. Deposition through the crop canopy is a big issue with insecticides. If you'll notice here how much of the coverage winds up on the top surface versus the bottom. So anything that improves deposition, puts more material on target, offsets the negative impact from UV light while improving coverage and reaching materials that are on the bottom. Keeping materials on target is a key part of the ESA compliance, and Bill will give us an update where we stand with that, and in particular with insecticides. Bill?
Thank you very much. Um, Thanks. I'd like to interject and spend a few minutes talking about the Endangered Species Act and what can we do as applicators and formulators to help. The EPA's goal in developing the Endangered Species Act, they have a herbicide and insecticide strategy. Their goal is to keep the pesticide on the field. So anything we can do to keep the material on the field, on the leaves, moving off, keep it from moving off site would really be helpful in this regard. They've developed a set of options for the user to help reduce spray drift and runoff and erosion. The majority, but not all, of threatened and endangered species and their critical habitat are not on the agricultural fields. So keeping pesticides on the field is the best way to protect these species. Next slide, please. Um, a question I'm asked quite often is, will all the pesticide labels change immediately? And the answer is no. All new pesticide labels are being evaluated to protect listed species. There's only a handful of pesticides that have been evaluated to protect the listed species. And currently registered pesticides may take up to several years for the process to catch up for all these pesticides. So a gradual change is helpful because that gives the user community time to figure out what's going on, how to adapt, and not have all their pesticides change immediately. Next slide, please. Where can I find ESA information? There's lots of really great sources. The EPA has a Bulletins Live 2 website. There's a mitigation menu. They have a new app for your computer, pesticide app for label mitigations that walks you through spray drift and runoff mitigation. The Center for Integrated Pest Management at NC State has a lot of good information on this topic and other pesticide topics. And I'm with the Weed Science Society of America, and we have a website with definitions, handouts, and presentations as well. Next slide. I'd like to walk through a couple examples of runoff and erosion mitigation options. For ground applications, they have 40 different ways to get points for this. This is a point system, and the more concern the agency has about runoff, the more points you will have to get. Many counties get runoff erosion relief points. There's conservation tillage or cover crops gets mitigation points. Grassed waterways or filter strips next to the field gets points. You get points for tracking mitigation measures. You get points if you reduce the annual application rate, and you can get points for working with technical experts on runoff and erosion control, etc. So there's a lot of ways to get points. Next slide. For spray drift, this is a percent reduction in spray drift. There's 15 ways for ground applications to get buffer reductions. You can increase the droplet size. You can add a drift reducing adjuvant for herbicides. One thing I'd like to point out, Liberty Ultra, the supplemental label now says there's no spray drift buffer if a drift reducing adjuvant is used at 0.3%. So drift reducing adjuvant is one way in some cases to completely remove spray drift buffer. You can lower the boom height, you can reduce the single application rate, or if you have windbreaks downwind, that can be counted as well. Next slide, please. There's some additional materials I want to point out. CPDA, CropLife America, and the Ag Retailers Association, pardon me, have a website, and they have United for ESA Success. They have a number of presentations and information there. Next slide, please. They have I've seen these four really great short presentations, adapting to ESA, Bulletins Live 2, Spray Drift, Runoff, some really great short presentations walking you through them. They have ESA 101, a flow chart, and educational resources as well. Next slide. And then you should all be receiving this week, we hope, the Crop Life magazine has an ESA technical guide for mitigation options, and I'm hoping that will be a really great resource for people as well. And now I'd like to turn it back to Johnny, if I may. Next slide.
Thank you, Bill. Before we get too far ahead, oftentimes there's confusion about what's a deposition aid and what's a drift control agent. And if we go by definitions here, that it's straightforward. Just keep in mind that while arguably any drift reduction agent can be argued to be a deposition aid, is keeping more on target. But just keep in mind that not all deposition aids have the ability to reduce driftable fines. Next slide, please. In terms of types of drift reduction and deposition aids, you'll find that there are those commercially based on oil emulsions, some based on polymers, some based on organic gums. Many of them have the ability to improve deposition and retention while at the same time reducing driftable fines. And they've had a very long and established commercial use in aerial applications, particularly with insecticides. Next slide, please. If we look at aerial application and their characteristics, it's quite a bit different from the variables that we're dealing with by just ground. The spray application volumes tend to be low, 3 to 5 GPA. They have very high levels of agitation. And increasing deposition while reducing evaporation of the applied spray is a major goal. And both of those factors are intertwined here. We are dealing with both trying to improve deposition while at the same time reducing evaporation. Next slide, please. So we look at how water limits the overall effectiveness of aerial applications. Well, your foam problems tend to be that much worse because you've got so much agitation. Compatibility tends to be more of a challenge. Oftentimes, we get very, very poor coverage and failure to even get to a crop canopy due to evaporation, bounce, and runoff. And then we also have the unfortunate deal of creating driftable fines. Next slide, please. It can be quite dramatic. If we look at just water alone, you can begin to see in an aerial application how little of it actually gets to the bottom. We're dealing with a tendency of water to bounce when it hits a surface. We call that dynamic surface tension. And then we're dealing with, once it does hit that surface, the coverage can be very poor. This is static surface tension. There's evaporation loss. And as we mentioned, compatibility problems are aggravated by being in such low spray application volumes. Next slide, please. So we can complement aerial applications by reducing evaporation, improving compatibility, and reducing foam, and then getting overall more material on the target where the deposition aids come into play. Next slide, please. It can be quite dramatic, as you can see in this example here with adjuvant versus none at all. It is really quite interesting, and I think that's why it's so well established in aerial application, just how dramatic you can be with reducing the amount that is moving off target, keeping it focused where it needs to be. Next slide, please. So typically, what you'll find in aerial applications, by far the most likely adjuvant to be used is a DRA or a deposition agent. You'll find references to this type of adjuvant being used in aerial application for over 50 years. The first documented use of polyacrylamides goes back to 1966 in aerial applications. Typically, oil emulsion adjuvants are used extensively. Uh, Back before BT cotton, we had a very extensive application of oil emulsion adjuvants with pyrethroid insecticides. And then we have when the goal is reducing driftable fines, these materials have a role as well. But being able to improve deposition while reducing evaporation becomes the primary goal. Next slide, please. Evaporation is extremely detrimental to getting a good aerial application by air. As we learned earlier, if you lose water in your spray deposits, your ability to enhance absorption goes down if it's a contact. Its ability to penetrate crop canopy goes down at the same time. You can also get this problem of particle drift, where if the water evaporates out of the spray deposit as it's reaching the target, you can have off movement of particles, not vapor. The amount that is absorbed is reduced. The reduced volume of spray deposit has a direct impact on how little of it gets distributed. And so this compounds the coverage problem that we've been dealing with from day one. Next slide, please. This is some work that was done by the GRDC, and it shows the impact of low humidity on evaporation. And here, if as you can see, if we get very much below 60% humidity, it can be quite severe, the amount of water that is lost. And in some cases, you can almost have a total loss of the water-based carrier. And as you can imagine, what that would do to things like deposition through the canopy and then absorption and, of course, contact and coverage. One of the things that I often pointed out to people that are in the southeastern U.S. where the humidity level is so high, the ultimate adjuvant for their application is humidity. And in those cases, it's offsetting a lot of this evaporation issue, which is a big problem. Next slide, please. So what are the general guidelines of using a deposition DRA adjuvant in aerial application of insecticides? Be very careful with your use rates. If you get above 2.5% by volume, you may do what's called an inversion. Essentially, that is a mayonnaise type thickening of the mixture, makes it very, very difficult to apply particularly the spray application volume is less than 3 gallons. So watch that 2.5% max. Another thing that is very problematic is having fertilizer, which is a very common joint application with insecticides. Strongly recommended that we use compatibility agents in situations like that, because what happens, you'll get a lack of uniformity in the spray application mixture. Gravity always wins. A lot of these materials will actually rise to the top, and this can be very, very detrimental to getting a uniform application. Some DRA adjuvants, particularly gums and inverting oils, may require very unique mixing instructions. Always check with the label. We typically recommend adjuvants be added last in the case of an oil-based system, but here there can be exceptions to that. So be aware of those and refer back to the label. Next slide, please. The next subject that we're going to talk about is water quality. And water quality can have a very detrimental impact on insecticide efficacy by degradation or actually decomposition of the active ingredient. And this is an issue that has been well established and studied with insecticides for many, many years. Keep in mind that insecticides, the modern insecticides that we deal with today, are by their design meant to be fragile, meant to do their job and disappear. So they're meant to hydride. You want them to do that. Of course, the goal is to not have them do it during the application and to let us get the full impact from that active ingredient. Next slide, please. It's quite extensive. If you look any of your insecticide active ingredients, you will find half-lives at very pH. One of the things that you'll immediately discover is how this is a lot more complex than what a lot of people have treated it in the future, in the past. Next slide, please. This is verbiage that we actually took off of insecticide labels, looking for guidance on this pH issue, and you'll find that it's quite variable. You'll see instructions like keeping it between 6 and 8, but then you'll see other instructions, don't let it go below 3. You'll see instructions about if you're above 8, you have to use a buffer or get it to for neutral. You'll see warnings that if the pH is less than 6.5, phytotoxicity may occur. So this is a lot more complicated issue than what people have done historically in trying to manage it. Next slide, please. So what we're dealing with is hydrolysis. It's a chemical term for how these these active ingredients break down. And yes, historically, it has been an issue when we get above pH 6. So there is a tendency to, well, look, we'll just throw anything acidic into the spray mix and offset the problem. And it's a lot more complicated and nuanced from that. And just as we repeated earlier. Next slide, please. So what are some general guidelines that we can do? If it's more complicated than just throwing in some acid into the tank, here are the guidelines that we can follow. And I took these out of the water quality bulletin that Purdue put out. But if you keep your pH between 3.5 and 6, you'll find that's satisfactory for almost all the insecticides. And you've got a short-term storage of the mixture between 12 and 24 hours. So that is a good general rule, keeping the pH between 3.5 and 6. And with the idea that we apply this within 12, 24 hours. If you're in a neutral situation, a pH between 6 and 7, that's going to be adequate if you make the application as an immediate one. Do not leave this mixture in the tank for more than 1 to 2 hours. If you're in alkaline conditions, that's when the clock is really starting to run. If you're above a pH 6, you have got to apply the mix as soon as possible to offset this loss due to hydrolysis. Keep in mind that higher temperatures and time have a bigger impact than the pH itself. The higher the temperature and the longer the spray mix is together, the more likely this decomposition problem is to occur. So fortunately, we have adjuvants that can be used to offset this, give us more time, put us in a range that we need to be in. Next slide, please. It is important to look at understand the difference between a buffer versus an acidifier. Acidifiers don't really have a bottom floor. There is such a thing as a negative pH. You get so acidic that you get below the warnings that some of these materials have, particularly you get below a pH of 3. Examples of acidifiers are things like phosphoric, sulfuric, muriatic acid, vinegar, those type of things. Those are acidifiers, not necessarily buffers. Buffers are designed to modify to a pH to a certain value and hold it. There are any number of commercial buffers on the marketplace are designed specifically with that in mind. Next slide, please. So with biological and organic insecticides, we have some opportunities to use adjuvants as well. As we know, we learned from our last webinar, biologicals and organic insecticides can have some real challenges when it comes to issues like UV light degradation, wash off, rainfall, and those type of things. And what we use in organic applications as it relates to spray adjuvants, they do have some different rules. And fortunately, we have quite a few OMRI listed spray adjuvants that can be used in these applications. Next slide, please. I've included in the presentation 2 links here. First, there's quite a few adjuvant types that have been approved for use in organic applications. There are soaps, oils, lipids, even organosilicones that actually have been OMRI listed for use. And you can click on one of these links specifically and get all the various commercial listings that have that recommendation today. Next slide, please. BT-based insecticides specifically have adjuvant recommendations or suggestions in them. There's quite a number of them on the marketplace. Optimal coverage is critical to getting these materials to work effectively and reproduce in a way that's reproducible. BT activity is impacted by sunlight, rainfall, and water quality. Deposition adjuvants can overcome the sunlight problem by getting them into the shade, as we learned earlier. Adjuvants that provide some degree of sticking can produce rainfall, wash-off issues. Be very careful with the pH issue. You can get into some issues if you take the pH too low. Typically, optimum is around 6, but levels above 8 can be very difficult due to instability. Next slide, please. So insecticide mixes are very common with multiple products. And as we add more components, and particularly in lower spray volumes of water, we tend to get more problems. Next slide, please. So one of the things before we even start thinking about spray mix compatibility is always keep in mind, start clean and clean at the end of the day. If we let residues hang around in this tank, that makes the clean out that much more difficult. Next slide, please. So general guidelines for compatibility, always keep in mind prevention rather than resolution. Dilution is often the solution, but avoid pre-mixing undiluted products. This is probably the source of 80% of our mixing problems when mixtures that are meant to be diluted come in direct contact with one another. Conduct jar tests. If you're doing a spray mix that has never been done before, always look at a jar test or consult the manufacturer directly. Recognize that additional order matters. With oil adjuvants and emulsifiable concentrates, we tend to add those materials last. Next slide, please. So we have this great tool, compatibility adjuvants, that can help us overcome a lot of these problems, again, as preventatives. The range of these materials can be as low as 1 pint per 100 gallons of water, and I stress here when we use them as preventative. If you have a fertilizer in a spray mix, we typically recommend a compatibility agent, strongly recommend it, because we are dealing with situations where materials can separate. And understand that we're not dealing with just uniformity in the spray tank. We're concerned about uniformity in the spray deposit itself. It's important that it be uniform from top to bottom. As always, we spray mixes should be applied as soon as possible. Next slide, please. Foam is something that, and from my experience on the tech support side, this is our number one issue as far as an application problem. And it's more than a nuisance. It can impact your calibration, worker exposure issues increase. It increases the difficulty of obtaining a uniform mix to begin with if it's full of foam. And then coverage and drift potential can also be negatively impacted by foam. And what we're finding is these problems are getting more extensive as we get more multiple spray mixes and lower spray volumes of water and more suspension concentrates. We are getting more foam. Next slide, please. Fortunately, we have an adjuvant that is very, very effective as a preventative and even a curative. And you'll find that the use rates can be as low as 1/2 an ounce per 100 gallons of water. Now, here's the thing that we always stress. These things are more effective as preventative. I know it tends to be human nature to, you want to spray these on top of a foam that's already been formed. They work much better when they are added first. And one very safe declaration I can make is that assume that every spray mix has the potential to generate foam. So we typically include these foam control agents with all of our applications. And again, they work much better as preventative. Next slide, please. What are some other guidelines that we can recommend for maximizing our insecticide efficacy? One, keeping these materials out of direct sunlight and at temperatures less than 90 degrees goes a long way to not losing the efficacy of these very fragile active ingredients. Some labels will even recommend that you only make applications after 3 p.m., particularly for some of these actives that are sensitive to sunlight. And one of the things that we want to stress, because it's such a common practice to mix fertilizers and combine in a treatment with insecticide, be aware that some of your fertilizers are on the alkaline side and you're really aggravating this stability problem. So know what you're doing with the fertilizer component. Is it getting it out of a pH range that is safe for that active ingredient to be from a stability standpoint? Next slide, please. So summarize, what does all this mean? Well, obviously, one more level of complexity. This insecticides can prevent a particular really application and performance challenges for growers. And unlike herbicides, we don't have a lot of labeled guidance. So this is where you, as a agronomist or an applicator, you've learned these particular issues, how to address them, what adjuvant to recommend. That helps them sort through the complexity. That's one of the things that really adds value to the services that you bring to that grower. And they'll be depending on you more for this in the future as we get even more levels of complexity. Next slide, please. And again, wrapping up some of the things that applicators and growers will encounter. Multiple spray mix combos add to the complexity, to the challenges. There are environmental variables like we don't get to farm indoors, we farm outdoors. These variables are always going to be in play. Formulation types can be quite diverse. You have now the ESA management piece. For example, something like BT insecticide, very benign, but you also have to keep it on target and away from endangered species that it would be problematic with. One of the things that we always stress is that you're getting more technical information, more extension publications on the subject. We're not so much in the wilderness like we used to be, but always review and look at that. Another thing we like to stress is that when you encounter a problem and then learn of a particular way how to fix it, share that information. Share that information with the manufacturer of the pesticide, of the adjuvant. There's nothing like spreading the word, so to speak, when we've been able to address problems. Again, it's always better to focus on prevention rather than cures. Always include a foam control adjuvant. If you've got a fertilizer in the mixture, always include a compatibility agent. And unfortunately, you're going to be the one doing the jar test. I had a discussion with others in this field, and we talk about these jar tests, how critical they are. I can never give you an example where a grower has done a jar test. This is an expectation that they have of the people that are selling and promoting the materials. So if you're in the unknown here, you've never had a particular combination, you don't have any background from the manufacturer, you should conduct the jar test to get that assurance that the grower needs. Next slide, please. Inevitably, when you're dealing with adjuvants, you have grower pushback, grower concern. It's very can be very difficult in this day and time to promote the addition of another input when you're expecting that input to do the job without help, so to speak. There's a assumption by a lot of growers that if these things were really needed, the manufacturers would build them in, and oftentimes they do. You have any number of pesticides in the marketplace that have adjuvant systems built in, but the challenge is that growers will oftentimes vary the spray application volumes. We don't have a one size fits all because of that. And oftentimes we just strictly run out of room in the pesticide product to include the adjuvant system. So no, we don't, manufacturers don't have the option to always build them in. You'll also get a response that, well, I've never had mixing issues before. Why am I worrying about this now? Be aware that both pesticide and fertilizer formulations are subject to change. Do not assume the absence of problems. And of course, you'll get pushback like, well, I don't know what I would even need them, particularly with insecticide labels, which lack specific adjuvant recommendations. And the, the, the point we like to make there is that problems like foaming and getting pesticides to mix with fertilizer are so common that we know they're going to be along for the application, and we try to address them accordingly. And the inevitable issue of, well, they just cost too much. It's one more cost that's being added. Our argument there is that if we can prevent a compatibility and application problem, that is going to be cheaper in the long run than the cost of having to deal with them up front. Next slide, please.
All right, gentlemen, thank you for that wonderful presentation. We have a few minutes here for Q&A. So I'll start with some of the questions posed in the chat. The first being, are insecticides generally as prone as some herbicides to binding with cations found in hard water? And would you recommend an acidifier or a water conditioner like AMS to be used with insecticide applications applied in hard water sources with a pH greater than 8?
With insecticides, you'll find that very few, and I can't think of an example, have that classic incompatibility issue that glyphosate has, for example, being bound by hard water cations. Their issue tends to be one of pH. Arguably, your water could be very, very heavy, very high hardness, but if the pH was neutral, you're good to go. The issue there is that typically if the pH, if the water is hard, the pH tends to be on the high side anyway. So we'd be looking at buffers in these hard water conditions, particularly when the pH is on the high side. But again, it's the pH that is more of an issue than it is the ion attraction that we have with herbicides. Next.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. Next question. Can I just increase coverage and canopy penetration by greatly increasing pressure on my sprayer?
So what I would say on that is that that's not as good an idea as you think it is because what you do is you're making a lot more small droplets, and you may actually increase the coverage that's on the top of the plants, but those little droplets, they lose their momentum right away, and so you're not going to get it down into the canopy. And so I would much rather have you use a drift or a deposition agent, which would be like a DRA, in order to get that improved deposition and canopy penetration, and not just raise the pressure.
Next question, how much drift reduction can I actually get by using a DRA or drift reduction agent?
So you can get quite a bit, and so I'm going to throw this thing out as a generality. There are exceptions to this, but as a generality, we're worried about those small droplets, and we can, with a good drift reduction adjuvant, um, basically reduce the amount of the spray volume that's in those small droplets by around 50%. And so actually you should get a lot more drift reduction than the 50, because those little droplets, there's lots of droplets that don't contain much in each droplet. And then on the other side, you've got these bigger droplets that contain most of the spray volume. But kind of a rule of thumb is that generally you're going to get about 50% reduction in the amount of droplets that we would call fine sized droplets.
You
And
mentioned, sorry, go ahead, Johnny.
and recall that besides the drift issue, those fine droplets evaporate much quicker
They do.
and mitigate, and that has a direct impact or can have on the efficacy itself.
You mentioned when we have humidity below 60% that we might see some performance issues. What part of the U.S. Tends to be the biggest problem? And are there any rules of thumb for reduction in performance if we don't have an adjuvant in the tank in these situations?
There are some studies that actually explore that. Obviously, when we get out of the southeast and we get into the southwest and western parts of the country, upper Midwest, that's where our humidities levels can get very low compared to what the southeast has. The thing I want to stress there is that the temperature and the low humidity is where the big factor is. As far as the percent reduction, I know that's why you'll see the labels can be so strenuous and warning about your spray application volumes. They typically try to address the issue by having the volume of water high. And what we'd like to promote and suggest here is that we can stay on the lower side of that recommendation for spray application volume if we can retard it, keep the evaporation rate down.
You also mentioned that we need to add an adjuvant to adjust for pH. And what parts of the U.S. do we see a pH greater than 6?
Though that tends to be the majority of them. Now, some obviously are much worse than others. The record I've seen is a application water that was at a pH of 9, but most of what you run into is above 7, probably 7.5 to 8.5 is very, very common.
Yep.
What common adjuvants do you see for use in organic farming?
I would say the class is surfactants because of a lot of these biologicals are so dependent on coverage to maximize their efficacy. So typically you run into uses with surfactants that are able to wet and spread and improve that coverage.
Fantastic. Well, I have put the CEU credit QR code on the screen. I will come back to it in just a second to round out the webinar, but I also wanted to throw up this final slide for our next webinar, which will be held Wednesday, January 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern. That should say 2026. Hope all of you have a safe and happy holiday season. And I will throw the QR code up one more time. But again, want to thank Johnny and Bill and Greg for being on today, and for CPDA for partnering with ARA on this series of webinars. I hope you found it very helpful, and hope you will see us all in the new year, and appreciate you joining us today. And special thanks again to Growmark for sponsoring today's webinar, and for the CPDA Working Group for helping put together some of this content. Thank you again, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.